Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and for the invitation. So actually we can observe an increasing interest in the reflection on the science policy society interface. There are various events, workshops, initiatives popping up, for example the INCSA network, and a lot of publications out there. And actually I think stepping back and reflecting on this interface is worthwhile because it can in the end improve governance. The criteria of credibility, legitimacy and policy relevance or salience, they are widely shared, but they alone can no longer guide the science policy interface. So we need a more precise understanding, more specific understanding of what these criteria mean in practice. I'd like to present you a few insights from the project that was just mentioned on by a joint initiative by UNEP, UN Environment, and the MCC to reflect on the science policy interface in the sustainability realm, more precisely about global environmental assessments. And actually, for this project, we asked several national, or we analyzed what different national governments, international organizations, and other stakeholders thought about the reform of the IPCC. And actually this is the result. They were mainly interested in focusing more on solutions. So what the demand is to have more assessment of solution options in the realm of climate change, mitigation and adaptation. And this is particularly interesting in the new context of the emerging landscape of international environmental governments, for example, the Paris Agreement and the adoption of the SDGs. And so there's a need for better understanding interdependencies between policy fields, the interlinkages between policies, and so side effects, co-benefits and all this stuff. And I think while there's a lot of expertise on climate smart agriculture and adaptation mitigation in agriculture, there's still a lack of a higher level of integration across different policy fields. Just an example, I mean, we still have two separate IPCC working groups on adaptation and impacts on the one hand and on mitigation on the other hand. So how, so the attempts to better integrate these and interlink these are still limited. And I think also on various governance levels, on national level, subnational level, regional level, a lot of open questions still remain. Let me explain what kind of knowledge is needed in principle more precisely. It's a complicated figure, but it's important to understand that the point is we do not only need to better understand options to achieve like multiple targets such as the SDG related targets. It's more or less more important maybe to understand the practical implications of these options and understanding these implications, for example, in terms, very obviously in terms of productivity, economic implications, but also distributional effects, food security. You have the side effects of GMO, fertilizers, pesticides. You have effects on freshwater resources. You have, of course, this climate change effects, all these things, but also maybe less discussed effects in terms of cultural effects, procedural effects of different policy pathways and options. And analyzing and better understanding them will help us better integrate these policy fields. And in fact, in light of these consequences or practical implications, we might have to revise the initial sets of means and policy goals. Related to that is another challenge, a twofold challenge, and this has to do with big literature. As we can observe, at least regarding climate change, we have an explosion of literature. The next IPCC assessment will have to deal with roughly 300,000 publications in the realm of climate change. To be comprehensive, which is still the mandate of the IPCC and other assessment bodies, somehow bibliometric tools so have to be adopted. But there's also another challenge, and this has to do with the variability of results, also regarding agricultural policy. So there's sometimes a cacophony of results, for example, effects of GMO or fertilizers or pesticides, to take these examples, or the potential and limitations of ecological agriculture. I mean, these are highly disputed things, but there's also highly disputed studies related to that, very different viewpoints. To bring them together and make them comparable and at least understand why they differ, we need more systematic meta-reviews and meta-studies. So this is one another challenge related to the solution orientation that is demanded currently. A third field of challenges is related to the legitimacy. Obviously, discussing solution options regarding the future of agriculture involves lots of value-laden conflicts. The IASTD, the agricultural assessment a few years ago, had huge problems with these value conflicts and actually had a hard time to deal with them, and this should be a warning signal. So what do we do at the Science Policy Society interface with these diverging values and diverging viewpoints in the end? And often, because it's so disputed, many decision makers and experts think that experts should not touch upon these value-laden things. And so we have two standard models still out there in practice. The one is the technocratic model, the other the decisionist model. Technocratic model tries to avoid value-laden conflicts by identifying some value consensus or allegedly value-free determination of both policy objectives and means. While the decisionist model just takes political targets as a given and only identifies the appropriate means for achieving these targets. But in both cases, you have the problem that, what about unintended consequences? What about side effects, co-benefits? Who's responsible for them and who has to deal with them? And in principle, the problem is that facts and values are so interlinked, so entangled, that these models in practice and in theory always fail. So what can be done? There's one approach that the IPCC, Working Group 3, tried to realize last time for the AR5 assessment report. And this is the joint and integrated cartography of alternative policy pathways. The idea underlying this is that you cannot avoid addressing value-laden things at the Science Policy Society interface. So how do you do that? There's no way to do this, like to just determine what's the right or wrong value belief, or just to present facts without any value implications. But instead, what you have to do, just present alternative pathways, but not only that, really try to explore the implications, as I said before. And this may facilitate a learning process among all actors involved, actually including the scientists and the experts. It's not only a learning process among the policymakers, it's really about learning process among everyone involved about the pros and cons of alternative policy pathways. It's an iterative process. It's sometimes painful and a very long time-consuming process, but it's very worthwhile. And actually, that's one of the results of our studies with UNEP, that actually the impact of scientific policy advice rarely is about influencing any policy decisions directly. It's more or less, it's more subtle. It's about facilitating these learning processes, facilitating a deliberation. It might turn out that some overlap might be identified between very different and disputed value beliefs, and overlap in terms of policy options that might serve various value beliefs and value sets. And at least it might help better understand what the conflicts are actually about, because discussing and arguing about abstract values is rarely a fruitful exercise. So, final slide. Large-scale assessments that bring together different viewpoints from the sciences and try to assess them, to synthesize this knowledge, meta-studies, meta-analysis, and in the end assessment, together with stakeholders, very different stakeholders from business, industry, NGOs, and of course governments and different decision makers. These processes, there are more than 140 global environmental assessments thus far. I think they are, despite being time-consuming and often being painful, they might provide the opportunity to explore these pathways. And there's also increasing attempt to do this on national levels. And of course, there are various challenges related to that in terms of capacity, resources, and also the incentives within sciences to at all provide solution-oriented knowledge. But this is roughly overview of this project. Thank you very much. Stop here.